Hi, I'm James Naylor Green, professor of Brazilian history and culture at Brown University and the national co-coordinator of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. This program is part of the Democracy Observatory and is supported by the Washington, Brazil office. This is Brazil Unfiltered. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Leonardo Avritzer, who is a full professor of political science at the Federal University of Minas Gerais. He was the director of the Brazilian Association of Political Science and is a member of the board of the International Political Science Association between 2016 and 2018. He was a visiting professor at the University of São Paulo, Tulane University, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Since 2018, Avritzer coordinates the Election Observatory, which brings together political scientists to gather empirical data on the electoral process in Brazil. He also coordinates the Participatory Democracy Project. And now let me just go into a little bit of his work. He's written so many books that I couldn't possibly describe all of them, but I want to talk about a couple. He is the author of among his major works, Democracy in the Public Space in Latin America, published by Princeton University Press, in which he argues that democracy can be more inclusive and can depend on a sphere of autonomous association by citizens. In that regard, since the first decade of the century, he has worked with participatory budgets and has published two important books on the subject: Participatory Institutions in Democratic Brazil and A Inovação Democrática no Brasil. Another recent work, The Pendulum of Democracy, discusses the oscillation of Brazilian politics from an expressed democratic consensus between the end of the military dictatorship in the early 80s to a situation of distrust in democratic institutions since the beginning of the 2010s. The book analyzes the behavior of the middle classes and elites who align themselves with anti-democratic discourse and of popular sectors which have adhered to anti-politics, pointing out that even in periods of democratic normality, latent anti-democratic elements remain waiting to be mobilized. This is due in part to the patrimonial state, a judiciary made up of elitist forces, aversion to the agenda of the defense of individual rights and guarantees, and persistent presence of the influence of the armed forces, which has not been fully subject to political and civilian control. And this book won the Victor Nunes Leal Award for the best book in political science. Leo, welcome to Brazil Unfiltered.
Thank you very much, Jim. It's a pleasure to be with you. I've been at Brown many times and seen you there, and I also admire very much your work. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, I must admit I'm overwhelmed by the production that you've done, which is so extensive in Brazil. So you're currently working on the survey called The Face of Democracy. Could you talk a little bit about the survey, what its methodologies are, what its goals are?
Yeah, well, since 2018, we've been surveying on a yearly basis the Brazilian public opinion on democratic habits. It's true that other institutes also have done that. La Pop at Vanderbilt University does that on a regular basis as well. But what we decided that we want to do in order to show a better picture of what Brazilians think about democracy is to ask Brazilians on many different issues about their democratic habits, democratic behavior, how they see democracy, how they see democratic institutions, Congress, the judicial system, etc. And the data in general has been very concerning. Since our first survey in 2018, we're the first one who found that the majority of Brazilians would favor a break with democracy in case of too much corruption or too much crime. This is a data that we produced in March 2018. And unfortunately, we were right. Brazilians were not very much concerned with democracy. They were concerned with crime and corruption, and they were willing to vote for someone who would break for democracy. And this is what Bolsonaro administration has been doing.
So what's the methodology of the survey? Is it a national survey or is it regionalized?
It's a national sample. It's representative for all the regions of Brazil. It's also representative for the larger states, such as São Paulo. So it's also, we use quotas, though, you know, Brazil has not have a census since 2010. So we cannot even know if the quotas we're using are right, because Bolsonaro scaled back the money and then suspended the census in 2020. So at this point, we cannot even know which are the main features of the country's population.
Wow, wow. And did he do that in part for political reasons, or was it just the argument of COVID and trying to save money?
2020, first of all, due to the fiscal effort that the economic minister, Paulo Guedes, was doing, he scaled back money for the census, and then the pandemic. Still, we don't have data on Brazil. This might even influence the election, the polls on the election results, because we're using 2010 census plus PNAD, a Pesquisa Nacional de Amostra e Domicílios. It has a very large sample, so we try to correct some of the changes. Can you imagine how much income in Brazil has changed since 2010? And we operate on a very unstable data. Still, I think that our data in general would check against other major polling institutions such as Datafolha in São Paulo, and usually our data overlaps. So, well, at least in questions that are important, we can check. So I think that we have a sound methodology.
So let's dig deep into some parts of the survey. On the topic of satisfaction with democracy, the survey shows that 50.8% are dissatisfied, 26.7% are satisfied, and only 2.7% are very satisfied in 2022. But however, since 2018, the number of people who are satisfied with democracy has increased. Could you comment on this a little bit more?
Yeah. First of all, it's important to know that historically speaking, Brazil has had low levels of satisfaction with democracy. Here in the southern cone of South America, Brazil, since the beginning of the century, or even after all democratizations that took place during the 80s in Uruguay and Argentina and Brazil, Brazil has been the country with the lower levels of satisfaction with democracy. Even if we put Uruguay aside, that's a country that should belong more to a European scenario, let's say, in terms of democracy satisfaction, social security, etc. It's interesting that levels of support for democracy have been lower in Brazil than in Argentina. Even in Argentina, after the Corralito, the blockage of public savings of the whole population, levels of support for democracy have been higher than in Brazil. So we had a historical problem.
Leo, before you go on, could you explain why is that? Why are Brazilians, and I know you're doing quantitative work, but what would you say, I mean, in terms of analysis to explain this phenomenon? It's very disturbing to hear this.
Yeah, it's disturbing. Well, 2 points. One, it was improving. Which was the year in which level of support for democracy were the highest ever in Brazil? 2010. After inflation went down, after public policies for the poor were successful. So there is a feeling in Brazil, I think, that somehow overlaps the very poor and the very rich. The very poor because democracy doesn't work for them, and the very rich because they are not democratic. And somehow this is an overlapping that explains Brazil very much, and in my view also explains Bolsonarismo very much. So
let me ask you a question. So in 2010 is the end of the 8-year, 2-term of Lula. I think he leaves office with an approval rate of 80 to 85%. Probably the most popular president in the history of Brazil when he leaves office. I'm not sure if that's can be proven because I'm not sure we had polls for earlier periods, but certainly very popular. And even though the economy is starting to show small signs of weakness, it's still quite strong from the period in which Lula was president. So you're just making an argument that the success of the economy where both poor people benefited by social programs and wealthy people benefited by the economic policies of Lula created a good feeling in the country and therefore a good feeling towards democracy. Would that be a fair assumption to make?
Yeah, I would say so. I think a democracy has to work for the majority of the population. And this has been a historical problem in Brazil. So the fact that levels of poverty decreased, the fact that inequality decreased, the fact that access to health improved, that the public universities in Brazil democratized in terms of racial access, all these were very positive elements that changed the view of Brazilians on Brazilian democracy. But at the same time, this is exactly the moment in which the Brazilian elites started to attack Brazilian democracy. So it's a historical problem. In order for the Brazilian democracy to be strong, it needs to deliver to the majority or to the poor. But when it does it, it has its main elements within the Brazilian elites that we've been seeing how they act during the last 4 years.
And so you can see the phenomena after 2011 when President Dilma Rousseff is elected. The economy is starting to have problems. There's mobilizations in 2013, some of them critical of the government. And then there's a moment in which the elites realize, oh, we have the possibility of blocking the Workers' Party from remaining in power. There's kind of some protests in the streets. They're very ambiguous as to the nature of them. And then they go on the frontal attack and start pushing after the elections of 2014 towards her impeachment, kind of weakening her rule. So kind of a combination of economic problems and the poor feeling the squeeze, and at the same time, economic elite seeing an opportunity to bring down the Workers' Party government, I would assume. Now, how does that happen? How does that affect the increase in the sentiment towards democracy in the last 2 years under Bolsonaro? This is quite curious for me.
Yeah. So first of all, a comment on the first part. We made important progresses from 1994 to 2010 in terms of Brazilian democracy. For instance, we no longer had this idea that election results would be challenged by the losers. Every loser in elections between 1994 and 2010 accepted the results. And then we had, in my view, a positive overlapping between social mobilization and political institutionalization, in the sense that there were social movements, but social movements were making claims, and there were channels of institutionalization of these claims, conferências nacionais, national conferences on public policies that mobilized more than 6 million people during the first decade of the century. They were key for establishing a progressive agenda, for incorporating social movements into politics. June 2013 challenged all that, in the sense that on the one hand, there were people on the left that they wanted to radicalize what we had until then. But after a few weeks of demonstrations, it was very clear that right-wing forces were reorganizing themselves. Very right-wing journalists seized the opportunity and started to challenge the left government. After 1 month, Dilma Rousseff administration was on a hot spot. She managed to win the election of 2014, but there the first signs of problem with Brazilian democracy emerged. Aécio Neves, defeated candidate, accepted the result, but after 1 month, he gave an interview to a global newspaper, and he said, "I was defeated by a criminal organization." This was a global headlines. Yeah. After that, he went to the Congress floor and made a speech. "I will boycott and make everything I can to defeat this administration." And this is how Brazilian problems started, both from huge public mobilization outside the institutional sphere that were not clearly democratic in 2013, but absolutely non-democratic in 2015. And after that, the Congress that, in my view, recalled Dilma Rousseff's mandate. In my view, this is the best interpretation about the impeachment, since there were no legal grounds for it.
Right. So let's look a little bit more in your survey. You found in 2018 to 22, more than 50% say that democracy is preferable to any other form of government. In 2018, the first year of Bolsonaro's government, 21.1% responded that in some circumstances, a dictatorship may be preferable to a democratic government. But now, in 2022, that sentiment has dropped to 14.8%. In other words, there's less positive sentiment towards a possible dictatorship. What do you think contributed to this fall?
First of all, we are experiencing in Brazil a real threat to democracy. So maybe when we ask in polls or in surveys the question, are you satisfied with democracy, or is democracy preferable to any other form of government? This is a general question, no longer in Brazil. We are discussing the future of democracy in Brazil in real terms. Just to give one example, in between the start of the pandemic in March 2020 and early June 2020, Bolsonaro made 14 appearances in public. In every single one of them, he defended the breakdown in military intervention. Even important leaderships within the military also defended. And though he had the Minister of Defense that was trying to halt calls for military intervention, this guy, Fernando Azevedo, who was the Minister of Defense, was fired by Bolsonaro. He now has had for a long time Braga Neto, which is clearly a non-democratic general who is now going to be the vice candidate in his ticket for re-election. So Brazilians are realizing that they need to figure out if they want to live in a democratic country or not. This is what the next election is about. The next election is not about the return of Lula. The next election is whether Brazil will continue to remain democratic. And there are important forces that challenge democracy. We are speaking, today is July 2nd, Saturday. Yesterday, Braga Neto made threats against the electoral process in public. So we are experiencing a situation in which Brazilians are starting to figure out that democracy has advantages. First of all, the economy is in a disaster state. Second, we have never seen recently, at least since 1994, so much poverty in the streets. Third, a disaster of SUS, the integration health state system. Fourth, generalized corruption in education, with the minister who is challenging funds to neo-Pentecostals priests. Every single one of these characteristics is related to the cause of Bolsonaro for the breakdown with democracy. And I think that Brazilians are seeing that this is not society that we want. Yeah, so we don't want religious education having more money than public schools. We don't want a health system that starts immunization processes against COVID late because of attempts of corruption. We don't want the armed forces to receive the bulk of public investment in the country. So these are real choices for Brazil now, yeah? And I think that Brazilians are moving towards in the direction of democracy.
So in this regard, this seems to be a signal against the possibility of a coup and this vacillation that's going on in values between 2019 and 2020 and the present. So at the beginning of Bolsonaro's government, about 33.9% trusted the armed forces a lot. Now it's 20. Now in 2022, there's been a drop to 24%, so almost a 10% drop. Those who do not trust the armed forces rose from 18.7% in 18 to 29.2% in 22. So can you comment on that? Is that part of the same process?
Yes. Well, first of all, I think that it would be fair to say that the Brazilian armed forces paid a very low price for the authoritarian adventure. There was no transitional justice in Brazil. The military went to the Constituent Assembly and they got almost everything they wanted, their capacity to even intervene in the public order, but also they cut a deal in regard to receiving the very large chunk of public investments. Everything pointed into the direction of the military remaining a very powerful force with the capacity to intervene in politics. The Cardoso administration changed this a little bit. Cardoso, maybe because of his historical links with some people who were very critical of the military, such as Alfred Stepan, he had an agenda for the military. So he created a Ministry of Defense that was important during.
And it was a civilian was head of the Ministry of Defense,
headed
also
by a civilian. But during the inauguration of the first Minister of Defense, the military went there to salute him and left just after that because they thought that they should be the ones who indicated the Minister of Defense, and they didn't like Elcio Álvares was the first Minister of Defense. So, and speaking with several of the Ministers of Defense after Elcio Álvares, they all say the same thing, that they didn't have real influence in the organization of the armed forces, in promotions within the specific the Air Force or the Mariners within the specific branches. And after Lula's inauguration, we see a comeback. I'm publishing a book perhaps next year in which I have a chapter on the military. And I think that the first moment of this comeback clearly was 2008 and was related to the Amazon, when General Heleno made public remarks against the demarcation of indigenous lands in the Amazon. Lula wanted to punish him, and then the military didn't want, and he received a sort of reprimand that was very, very light vis-a-vis what he has done. After that, we've seen case after case in which the military would try to return to the political scene. The Brazilian peace force in Haiti did not help. On the contrary, it reinforced an idea of war against crime and violation of rights. And all this conducted to an idea of a very conservative armed forces, not committed to democracy. And I think that this was, they even collaborated in the impeachment because there was an important meeting between General Etchegoyen and Michel Temer when that was clearly an indication that the military were intervening and they favored the impeachment. All this together conducted to the Bolsonaro administration and the new influence of the armed forces. For you just to have one idea, in 2019, there were about 5,000 people occupying what we in Brazil call cargos de confiança.
Which are politically appointed positions that are appointed by the administration. They have power. They don't go through the civil service. Right?
Yeah, exactly. 5,000. And the number was higher than during the administration of João Batista Figueiredo, who was the last general to rule Brazil during the authoritarian period. So there is this reinsertion of the military into politics, both from above and from below. And I think that right now what Brazilians say, that the militaries, they are not more efficient than civilians. We see that when we think about MEC, the Ministry of Education, and when we think that among the most important appointed positions in MEC, 11 are military, and we see the disasters of educational policy. Brazilians look and they don't see the military as more efficient than the civilians. This is a myth. The idea that the military administer better, that they are more, let's say, that they are not corrupt, or they are more austerous in the way they behave. All these are myths that Brazilians are saying. What we're seeing is that we want the military in defense, responding to the civilians, but not intervening in politics and accumulating privileges.
It's very curious because Bolsonaro chose to. There was tremendous pressure because he's doing very poorly polling among women in the election polls, and so there was certain pressure within Congress to have him appoint the former Minister of the Agriculture, Teresa Cristina, as the Ministry of. Is that her name? Am I saying that right? Teresa Cristina. Yeah. As the Minister of Agriculture, representing those interests, and he chose Braga Neto, which kind of signaled once again his linkage to the military. And for some, I think this means the possibility of mobilizing the military should he lose the elections to overturn the results of the elections in some nefarious way. Do you think that's possible? That in fact, if he does lose the elections, he would call on the armed forces to support him in some kind of a coup attempt that would eliminate the democratic procedures?
Well, there are contradictory signals in this direction. Braga Neto is the worst possible member of the armed forces. It's important to know his itinerary in politics or within the military in order to see his position. So he was the military person in the military intervention in Rio de Janeiro that was decreed by Temer at the end of 2017. It's important to point out that a few weeks after his appointment, there was the assassination of Marielle Franco in Rio de Janeiro. He never made any attempt to investigate, or maybe he knew and he didn't need to investigate. We don't know what he knew, but an administration without any form of public accountability to Brazilians.
And to our listeners who might not know this, Marielle Franco was a left-wing Afro-Brazilian woman, bisexual or lesbian, who was elected to the city council and was assassinated in 2018. Since then, they have found the people who actually pulled the trigger, but they still have not discovered who ordered these assassins to kill her. And so this is still an unknown issue, and many speculate it might be the militias in the paramilitary militias in Rio, or perhaps people connected to the armed forces, although we don't really know.
Yeah, and also Marielle Franco assassination was kind of a message to left-wing forces in 2018, a message that, in my view, is not over, that violence is back in politics. That if you want to make left-wing politics, you're black, you're progressive, your life is in danger. And we've seen that also in the Amazon a few weeks ago, with the assassination of an important Guardian journalist and an indigenous in Brazil, from Funai, not by chance. That Funai almost fired him because of his positions. So what we're seeing in Brazil is a radicalization of certain agendas by the Bolsonarism. This is important to have in mind. The agenda of the environmental agenda, the educational agenda. These are agendas that Bolsonaristas want to radicalize. Since the very beginning, an anti-human rights agenda, they also want to radicalize it. And I think that the assassination of Marielle Franco was really the first step into the implementation of this agenda. So coming back to Braga Neto is the worst possible choice, but I think that the Brazilian military are fairly convinced that they should not intervene in this election. Why? I think that for three reasons. One, as I said, the authoritarian adventure ended up cheap for the military. They didn't pay much of a price, a political price. Right now, Bolsonarism is increasing this price. And I think that the increase in distrust in the military is one of these indications. Second, I think it's very important that the Brazilian military, they don't have too many values, but one value that they do have is hierarchy. They don't like hierarchy breaks. And it's very interesting because Bolsonaro is really the guy who broke all hierarchies, even in the military when he was there and he was expelled from the military because of breaks with hierarchy. I don't think that the military would enter into another hierarchy break or illegalities for Bolsonaro. They supported him, but I think that they have a strategic plan for Brazil that might not be democratic, but still they want hierarchy and order, and this is not Bolsonaro's agenda.
Oh, the military also faces the problem that at least since last year, the Biden administration sent a message through the CIA and later the State Department. And the woman, Elizabeth Bagley, who was appointed, was nominated to be the ambassador to Brazil, all saying the same message. And more recently, when Bolsonaro asked Biden to support him in the elections, that they believe that the Brazilian democracy is in good standing, that it's healthy, they trust in the elections, and I think basically sending a signal that they're not going to support a military adventure, a military coup, which is, of course, as we know, a very different kind of position than 50 years ago when, unfortunately, the U.S. government supported the military takeover in 1964. But the signals from Washington, at least publicly, seem to be that they will not support a military adventure. And I would assume this leads many sectors of the armed forces to think twice about embarking on such an activity.
Yes, I agree. And also in the region, we have a move in the region towards left administration. So a coup in Brazil and a right-wing non-democratic administration in Brazil would isolate Brazil in the region as a whole, from the US to Chile. Maybe the whole Americas would boycott such an administration. So the risks of embarking to such adventure are very high.
So let's talk a little bit about the churches, which in your survey found that trust in churches is 39.4% of the population, whether that's the Catholic Church or the evangelical Christian churches, which have grown significantly and have, I think, approximately 30% of the population now see themselves as evangelical Christians. How might this situation affect the elections?
Well, Brazil used to be a completely Catholic country during the late 70s, early 80s. Catholicism was very important for Brazilian democratization. If we think about the first strikes in the ABC, the region, the outskirts of São Paulo, where Lula was the leader of the first metal workers' strikes.
The one in 1978.
78, yeah. The Catholic Church was very important in supporting Lula and supporting the strikes, in supporting a human rights agenda in Brazil. But since the early 80s, the phenomenon in Brazil is not the growth of progressive Catholicism. Phenomena is the phenomenon is the increase in neo-Pentecostalism, intolerance, religious intolerance. Some states in Brazil have neo-Pentecostals majorities, though very few. The majority of the population of Rio de Janeiro declares itself non-Catholic. So we've seen huge change. In addition to that, neo-Pentecostals, they decided they would enter into politics, breaking with the tradition that Brazil had, that the Catholic Church would, of course, intervene in politics, but not directly. For instance, differently from Chile, for instance, which had a Christian Democratic Party. Brazil never had, or for a very brief period during the 60s, it had a Christian Democratic Party. So they created a bancada, a group of MPs with a very moral agenda, but they moved from the moral agenda to other agendas, to an agenda of presence in the media, radios, television. And at this point, they have a lot of influence. And what we know about neo-Pentecostals, they are more conservative than population as a whole. They are not in favor of distributive social policies. They transfer to politics an agenda of demarcation between the right and wrong that was not the religious agenda in Brazil, because the Catholicism in Brazil is very porous to different moral values. So all this has been a very important and non-democratic influence in Brazil. They supported impeachment, and especially
the Assembly of God.
Assembly of God. Edir Macedo recalled Dilma Rousseff. Up to that point, he was supporting Workers' Party administration. He broke a few weeks before the impeachment, and after that, the leadership of all neo-Pentecostal churches, or the most important, became very conservative leaderships. This is a problem for democracy in Brazil, because it seems that the agenda of the neo-Pentecostals is transforming a political majority into a moral majority. They attack cultural exhibitions, they attack sexual diversity, they attack women's rights, and this is creating a sort of caldo de cultura, or a cultural background against democracy at the societal level. Because democracy, in order to have democracy at the institutional level, you need also the population to be tolerant. There are some values, and this it's in the beginning of liberalism. We have seen many people who wrote about that. You need tolerance, you need diversity, you need people who accept the other, or other ideas, or value pluralism as important aspects of democracy. And I think that this is exactly the point that the neo-Pentecostal churches are touching. So it's important. In 2018, the highest levels of trust were with the churches and with the armed forces. Now, what our survey shows is that there is distrust with the armed forces, and there is a decrease in trust with the churches. So this is good for the environmental, the societal environment that would lead to the vote, or I think to a vote of return to democracy in Brazil, to full democracy in Brazil.
So regarding political parties, I think at the beginning of the Bolsonaro government, as your survey showed, 76.9% of the people surveyed did not trust the parties. And this year, 2022, there was a drop to 52.7% in the number of people who do not trust parties. So how can you explain the fact that the number of people who do not trust parties have decreased? And is this favorable for whom? For which political sector?
Well, to an American audience, you need to explain what parties in Brazil are, because Americans, even during Trump came to power through a party, yeah, and he was supported by a party. But this is not exactly the Brazilian situation. The Brazilian party system is completely fragmented. We have perhaps more than 30 parties with representation in Congress. The idea that you can change, or a politician can change from one party to another, is a common idea. Bolsonaro wanted to run first from the Patriots, and then he belonged to PSL, but now he's going to run through the PL.
The Liberal Party. Yeah.
The Liberal Party. So the idea that people make changes from one party to the other, and that parties are at best an organization through which you run to power, but you don't govern just through one party. You govern through a coalition of several parties. You govern through a coalition of a non-politicized bloc in Congress called Centrão. These are all key aspects of Brazilian politics. So Brazilians don't like parties or don't believe in parties. Distrust in parties is the highest level of distrust that we see. But Brazilians who like parties, they like the Workers' Party. So it's also somehow tricky, yeah? Because the Workers' Party, during especially the anti-corruption operation Lava Jato, its level of support went very low, below 10%. But after Lava Jato, after the release of Lula from prison, and after the moves that the Workers' Party made towards the center, the level of trust and support for the Workers' Party are almost the same ones of the ones that exist during Lula and Dilma Rousseff's administration. So what we make with that? We make with that we need to rebuild trust in parties in order to reconstruct Brazilian democracy. We need to rebuild the idea that some values or some practices by politicians are positive. So I see many people who say, well, if Lula is running with Alckmin, that's from other party, and this guy has been his previous enemy, it's because politicians cannot be trusted. And it's exactly the opposite, what's going on. But still very difficult for Brazilians to understand that what Lula is trying to do is to recover a positive dimension of politics in which he can speak with people that he former disputed elections. Lula disputed the 2006 election with Geraldo Alckmin. And this is not a problem because they both have in mind what is important for Brazil, that's the defeat of Bolsonarismo and the reconstruction of democracy in the country.
So let's look at two last areas that your survey covered. One is the question of trust in institutions, especially the STF or the Federal Supreme Court. That's declined, and Bolsonaro has been in pushing towards a questioning of the Supreme Court and its decisions. Could you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah. In 2018, when we asked about trust in institutions, the institution that has the higher level of trust among the others was STF, the Brazilian Supreme Court. Congress was very low, parties were very low. The other institutions that were high were not non-political institutions, let's say, armed forces or the church. Bolsonaro has been fighting or attacking the Supreme Court since at least since the beginning of the pandemic. One, because the Brazilian Supreme Court decided that states and cities, they had authority to handle the pandemic. So social isolation and then immunization in Brazil, they all were done by local administrations. So this decision by the Supreme Court completely eroded Bolsonaro's authority during the pandemic, and this was very important because Bolsonaro did not want to fight the pandemic. He wanted to make politics through throughout the pandemics. Yeah. In 2020 and 2021, more stronger attacks started against the Supreme Court. There were both YouTubers, very popular YouTubers, that we know that they are linked to Bolsonarism. We know that they are financed by public banks or public or state-run companies that started to attack the Brazilian Supreme Court. And then what Supreme Court has done, it defended itself by opening procedures against attacks against the Supreme Court itself. And Bolsonaro made a campaign that the Supreme Court was against freedom of expression. This was the core of the campaign. So this campaign reduced the legitimacy of the Brazilian Supreme Court. Our data show that. If we ask if the Supreme Court is right into halting some of the public manifestations against itself, or people should demonstrate or talk freely, Bolsonaro managed to convince a large group of Brazilians that he's right in this position, which is very concerning because certainly Bolsonaro will attack the Brazilian Supreme Court and the Electoral Court during the next 90 days until the election. So it's a situation in which Brazil will need a very strong Supreme Court, and we'll need the population behind the Supreme Court, because this is the institution that can contain Bolsonarismo right now.
And how does that relate to the Electoral Court, the TSE, in terms of its adjudicating? People in the United States might not know this, but there's a special court, a judicial court, which is headed by one of the members of the Supreme Court. It's rotating the person in charge, and they oversee the elections, rule on electoral issues, and actually are the ones who declare the official results.
Yeah, well, Brazil has an electoral authority that the US does not have. Yeah, the states in the US, they declare the electoral results, but no one declares, or the Electoral College, months after the election, meets to declare the result. Yeah,
actually, in the United States, who declares the results is the media, is the different TV stations will make. And in fact, one of the things that happened in the United States was that when Fox News declared that Arizona went to Biden, Trump went crazy because he thought that Fox News wouldn't do that, and it kind of signaled the fact that actually Biden had won the elections. So in Brazil, this official body,
electoral authority, and the electoral authority declares the winner of the election, usually on the same day. Also, it's very interesting because Trump challenges very much the early vote, which is it's a printed vote, we can say, where Bolsonaro challenges the electronic vote, the vote that's more trustable, and at least to my knowledge, is not really challenged in the US. So Bolsonaro, he wants the printed vote because the printed vote is more chaotic. Bolsonaro loves chaos. So an election with printed votes, a very slow electoral counting, this is what Bolsonaro wants. Somehow what has happened in some of the US states, that it took for them days or weeks to count the votes, whereas in Brazil, these votes are counted in a few hours. Yeah. So what he wants to challenge ballots in every district. He wants an electoral result not to be produced fast, and he's going to challenge the electoral authority in this ground. And in this regard, he got the help of the army. No one knows exactly why electoral counting is armed force business. I don't know. Yeah, for some unknown reason, because they don't vote, they don't like voting. So why should they matter about electoral counting?
Yeah.
Anyway, what Bolsonaro wants is to put pressure on the electoral court not to declare a winner on election day. Yeah, this is his aim.
Which then opens up the possibility of maneuvers, chaos, mobilization, repression, and then the armed forces can argue that there's disorder in the society. They need to intervene and establish order. I guess that's the scenario that's being built.
Yeah, precisely. This is the scenario he wants. The non-declaration of a winner on election day. So for this, the printed vote is better than the electronic vote. The electronic vote in Brazil is trustable. It has been many elections took place through electronic vote. They have been audited by local and international companies, and we have no reason to believe that there is a problem with the system. But still, he challenges the system. But it's very interesting because people may not trust very much STF, but they trust the electoral system. This is another result that we produced in our survey. And the amount of Brazilians, number of Brazilians who trust the electoral court is very high, or who trust the electoral counting system is very high. So Bolsonaro, most likely in the next few weeks or months, he'll try to establish several conflicts, direct conflicts with the electoral court. And this conflict is very important for the electoral court to remain stable, to stand by its process, and to assure Brazilians that there will be a winner on election day.
Any last comments you'd like to share with our listeners about the political situation in Brazil today? Are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? What's your take?
Well, I think that the Brazilian democracy deteriorated a lot from 2014 to 2018, and the pandemic situation in the country has been disastrous. We paid huge price in terms of lives during the pandemic. But the fact of the matter is we are improving from a very low point. We reached a very low point in relation to democracy, in relation to social relations. Brazilians attack each other in the streets, neighbors fight with each other on politics. But I think that we have been successful in remaking what might be a successful coalition for rebuilding democracy. I think this is Lula's merit, but also Geraldo Alckmin's merit. And I think that the two together are pointing in the direction of the benefits that a return to democracy in Brazil might generate. So but I think that Brazilians are starting to figure out that democracy is the best way to resolve our problems. And in order to have democracy, we need to get rid of the current president. So I'm optimistic.
Yeah,
it's a long road.
As I say to my listeners, stay tuned. Much is yet to happen. So Leo, I want to thank you so much for joining us today on Brazil Unfiltered. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim.
So I hope you enjoyed the interview. If you are watching on YouTube, don't forget to like the video. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do so. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast, please leave us a 5-star review. It helps other people find the program. Have a great week. Until next time, até a próxima.